Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone who has joined us from different parts of the world. On behalf of Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, I welcome you to the first session of Kalam on the Net. We are delighted to present The Promise. Damon Galgut discusses his Booker Prize winning novel with Sandip Roy. Quick introductions. Winner of the 2021 Booker Prize, Damon Galgut has been shortlisted for the Booker twice previously for his novels The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room. His novel Arctic Summer was nominated for the Walter Scott and Folio Prizes, and his fiction has been published in 16 languages. We are delighted that Damon joins us today from Cape Town, where he lives and works. We would have been more delighted if he had been with us physically in Kolkata, but well. Today, he will be in conversation with festival regular Sandip Roy, a novelist and journalist. His first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title for the Asian Pacific American Literature Awards in the US and was listed for other awards, including the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He's a contributing editor for Huffington Post in India and a long-time radio commentator for National Public Radio in the US. And with that, over to you, Sandip.
Thank you, Sukanya. And Damon, welcome, sort of, to Kolkata.
I'm very, very pleased to be there, sort of.
Well, we'll try and change that later so that you're actually here instead of just sort of here. But let me start by asking you, you are such a low-key person. What's the question you are most tired of answering about winning the Man Booker?
Well, you do tend to get, the same sorts of questions, but I have been asked a lot about how it felt to hear that I was the winner. And oddly, it's a question I can't really answer because I didn't have much feeling at that moment. I was sort of a bit stunned and numb. But I'm not really tired of the question. It's just a question that I've answered a great deal, I think.
But so you mean that being shortlisted twice doesn't actually prepare one for winning?
Well, no, because actually what it does is prepare you to once again be one of the 5 people on the shortlist who didn't make it. So I was kind of braced for that eventuality, but fate had a different idea in mind at this time, I guess.
Well, we are thrilled that it happened. And I am sorry, our neighborhood dogs have all decided to start howling right now. So if you hear a background chorus, that's all the dogs in the neighborhood howling, and our dog will probably join very soon. But the thing is, you, from what I know, you try to live a fairly reclusive, solitary life, not really into social media. So before I start, I want to ask you, are you aware as a writer, as a person who deals in words, of this word game called Wordle? Do you play?
Actually, somebody mentioned it to me the other night, but that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. I'm not really familiar with how it works, but I've heard the name. That much I can say.
So that much it has penetrated, yeah, because it seems like everywhere I turn, everyone's sharing their Wordle score and Wordle prowess. Basically, it's a game where you have to guess a 5-letter word in 6 tries.
Okay. It sounds like it's fun, but my kind of fun.
Apparently, it's totally addictive, but you'll just have to take my word for it.
Your Wordle. Yeah,
my Wordle for it. It was created by somebody named, I think, Josh Wardle for his girlfriend who was into word games, and so from Josh Wardle called it Wordle, and then to his surprise, it took off. But unlike most social media things, it doesn't try to mine your data. It's a very civilized game, actually, for something
oddly,
in social media.
For a writer, I'm very bad at word games. I mean, I'm terrible at Scrabble, which nobody quite accepts. So I may not be any good at this game either, but I'll certainly be good.
You can give it a try. Well, let me ask this. I read that somewhere you said, in terms of when you were nominated for the Booker. You didn't think this could win because you felt The Promise was such an odd book. What did you think was odd about it?
Actually, I'm open to correction, but I think the comment you've picked up on may be related to my last nomination, because I thought In a Strange Room was too odd a book to,
maybe
to make the grade. But I certainly don't think The Promise is a conventional book by most measures. So yeah, you know, as you'll know, because I presume you've read it, it jumps very fast between between particular points of view. So the interior perspective of one character, even in the same sentence, suddenly becomes the interior perspective of another character. Sometimes we jump from one scene to another with absolutely no warning. So there is this very sharp, rapid cutting, as it were, from one point of view to another. And, you know, it was a worry for me in the writing of the book that this would actually carry over to a reader in a coherent and logical way. So, you know, firstly, I was gratified that it seemed to do that, but I did think, well, it's not as strange a book as In a Strange Room, maybe, but it might have been a little bit too unconventional in its mode of telling, really, to satisfy the prize or the requirements of the prize. But luckily for me, that has turned out not to be so.
You know, one of the things I noticed while reading the book, there's this one phrase that struck me, and it comes up at different points in the book. At one point, you talk about the people in the scene turned at angles to each other. At another point, you talk about these invisible, powerful laws that people make and then lay down at angles across the earth. And then later on, there's a bit where she's reading the novel her brother has started to write, your character, and she's inside the sentences, one joined to the next, like a series of tunnels connected to each other at angles. And it made me wonder, for you, is that what writing's about? Coming at life at odd angles?
Wow, that's a very writerly question. You're far too attentive and sharp for my good. I'd never given it that consideration, to be honest, and I wasn't really aware of using the word angles in that way until you pointed it out. So it's definitely worth a contemplation. But yeah, I would think, you know, those images draw on a sense that I guess that when the world is in a harmonious state, my sense of it is that lines are running in parallel. When a certain you know, discord or lack of harmony enters in, it's as if you know, there are lines of communication that, as you picked up, are set at angles to each other. It's yeah, it's not a very thought through perception, but it's clearly, you know, what my mind was sort of getting at. I do think, you know, there's a description of E.M. Forster, who I wrote about in my previous book, of being a, well, I beg your pardon, it's a description used by E.M. Forster about the Greek Alexandrian poet Cavafy, where he talks about him as being a gentleman in a straw hat set at a slight angle to the universe. That's always been a very beautiful image to me, and it does sort of capture something of what I feel a writer's perception of things ought to be, which is, you know, not in total harmony with how the rest of the world sees things. It helps to be, you know, to use that phrase again, at a slight angle, because you're looking at things from a perspective that's maybe a little bit unexpected, you know, a little bit unpredictable. And I think that perspective is what gives us the ability to look at familiar things in an unfamiliar way, make them fresh, make them a little bit odd, and maybe, you know, perceive them anew. So I'd go with that. I think that's quite a good way for a writer to be approaching the world. Sandip, you've gone silent. I think you've muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself? I can't.
There we go. Yeah. No, I said, yeah, as you were talking, I thought, oh, maybe that is what is the difference between being a reporter and a writer sometimes, that, you know, a reporter must often look at it straight on, because you have to just say what you're seeing. You know,
right. Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Whereas it's kind of the task of a writer not to look at things the conventional way, to try to find an authentic way to look at things freshly. You know, we get a little dead to our own lives and to human life in general. Habit kind of numbs you. So, you know, one of the many things that books do is shake the world up and make it seem like a place you haven't been in before. Because then your thoughts about the world, your perceptions of it are new too, which is, you know, a useful outcome.
Do you remember the first book that shook you up?
I remember the story that first shook me up. Yeah, it's got quite a lot to do with my subsequent evolution as a writer. I mean, I was interested in books and writing from a very early age. And I'd been sort of trying to write stories of my own, but, you know, as one does, I guess, as a kid. But when I was about 12 years old, we had a really unusual English teacher who did things no other English teachers ever done. And one of the things that really sort of fired up my brain was he was reading us Roald Dahl stories. But I don't mean the children's stories. I'm talking about the quite twisted and dark adult stories, which were not really appropriate for 12-year-olds. But I couldn't have hoped for a better literary education. In particular, a story called Pig. I had recently become vegetarian when I was 12. And this story concerned a young boy, not unlike me, who was also vegetarian, and I absolutely identified with the central character. And, you know, for anyone who doesn't know the story, maybe not a, you know, great work of literature. I don't think that was Roald Dahl's claim to fame, but certainly a very subversive and entertaining story. It profoundly disturbed me. I mean, I ran home and told my mother, you know, that I'd heard the story and what it contained, and I think she was horrified. In fact, this teacher was told that he was not allowed to read these stories to us anymore. But he had given me, in particular, a very great gift. It was the first time I understood that writing didn't have to comfort you and console you and reinforce your sort of safe perception of the world. It could actually pull the rug out from under you and make you see life as something dangerous, threatening, odd. It could disturb, in other words. And that, as an aspiration, has been with me ever since. I respond best to stories that disturb your usual perception of things. And I still think it's one of the most powerful weapons in the hands of a novelist, is this ability to shake up people's perceptions. I always take it as a compliment when people tell me they're disturbed by something I've written, although it's not usually meant that way.
Well, I'm going to backtrack here and ask you something. You said at 12 you became vegetarian, and in The Promise, there is the character of this young woman who also at point becomes vegetarian and then vegan, and it causes great consternation. People around her who do not know, you know, a family don't know what to cook for her. Are they very worried? And when she's vegan, she brings her own vegetables to cook. Did it cause, at 12, when you do decide something like that, did it cause great consternation in your family?
Well, certain elements of the family, but in fact, I first became vegetarian to imitate my mother because she, from her own religious beliefs, had taken on vegetarianism. So, you know, it didn't cause, you know, trouble in the kitchen, as it were, because my mother was only too happy to cook for me in that way. But, you know, other members of the family were very upset. We you know, to state the obvious, you know, India has a long tradition of vegetarianism. It's not a strange thing. In South Africa, it's a nation of meat eaters. So I remember being told many times in my childhood by various family members that if I didn't eat meat, my brain wouldn't develop properly. I wouldn't be a normal human being. I mean, I don't know, perhaps they're right, but I haven't felt too bad.
In our part of the world, in Bengal, in Kolkata, we are actually always told that if you don't eat fish, your brain is not going to develop, and you're never going to crack those competitive exams and get ahead in life.
I did fish until adulthood, so perhaps that's what saved me.
Well, and let me get to the book itself as well. For those, we could call this book four funerals and no wedding. Well, actually, there is a wedding, but it just happens off stage, sort of. You don't get to go there. But how did you come upon this idea of looking at a family over 40 years, but just as they gather for funerals, so acutely observe them for a couple of days, and then just let 10 years pass?
I mean, that was what attracted me essentially to the notion of writing this book. And it came from a conversation with a friend of many years, who happens to be the last member of his family left. He's older than I am, but he's lost his parents, his brother, his sister. And one day we were having a long lunch and just talking about life. And he told me various anecdotes about the family funerals that he'd been to. And he was being, it sounds odd, but he was being very, very funny. I mean, he was picking up on the sort of human behavior that you see when groups of people come together, and especially when families come together. It's often the same people who recur at a funeral. They're a little bit older, but, they have the same habits or motivations or whatever it may be. And he was making me laugh in amongst all the kind of horror stuff that normally attaches to death and the burial of people we love. But I guess the combination of humor and horror, as well as the fact that if you look at any sort of family event, a certain picture opens up of that family. These things sort of, brewed in my head, and it sort of occurred to me that, well, that might be a very unusual way to tell the story of a family, as opposed to the usual sort of plodding description of and then. That you would just open the window on a funeral, you would see this family for a few days, and then that window would close again, and then, in the next section of the book, the window would open again, but it would be maybe, 10 years later, and a great deal has changed. I mean, for the family, but also for the country, as it happens. It was that notion that you could convey great leaps of time and what time does to this particular group of people that really attracted me. I like most writers, I'm always looking for an unusual approach that you haven't seen before, maybe. That was the initial hook that sort of pulled my brain when I first approached this.
And when you said, you open this window and you look at this family that has gathered for a funeral, and of course the country is also changing behind him, and you have these, that is Botha country, then it's Mandela country, then Mbeki and Zuma. But did that come in later for you, or was that also always your intention to use the family and also be showing the country, or did the country kind of creep in because the window was open?
Yeah, the latter. I was first preoccupied with telling the story of this family and their slow decline, and only in a sort of secondary way did it occur to me that if you space the funerals out, I mean, if you put more or less 10 years between each funeral, that it could, widen the window a little bit and show the country in the background. But I really wanted to keep it in the background. I wasn't interested in writing a sort of state of the nation novel. For better or for worse, a lot of people seem to have received it in that way as a kind of major comment on South Africa, but that really wasn't my primary motivation. I was really interested in time and what time was doing to these people. But then, of course, I'm interested in what time has done to my country too, because it's changed a great deal in the last 40 years. I mean, to state the obvious.
Did you have fun once you decided on the structure, did you have fun trying to figure out how you were going to kill characters off?
Killing characters isn't something that, provides me with a lot of amusement necessarily. In fact, I've always felt slightly guilty. There's a part of my brain that sort of likes to believe in an almost superstitious way that if you've imagined people in a story, in a scenario, that in some way they actually do exist, and that if you imagine some terrible fate for these people you've created, that in some parallel universe you are inflicting this fate on these innocent characters. So there is a certain guilt involved. But I did have a lot of fun writing the book, not necessarily because I was inflicting death on my creations, but because along the way, not at the beginning, but along the way, I discovered a narrative voice that was new to me. And that narrative voice was one that had a lot of zest and zip, a lot of motion and humor to it. And wielding that voice like a kind of weapon gave me an enormous amount of pleasure. It gave me the same sort of pleasure that some of us get from writing. Well, I was going to say letters, but if nobody writes letters anymore, writing messages in your own sort of fluid interior monologue, the way you see the world, the kind of freedom that comes with that. It was that sort of pleasure, and not all my books have given me that kind of enjoyment. So there were several departure points with this novel from my usual zone of operation, and that was one. So yeah, I got fun, but not from killing my people.
Kill people or figuring out how to kill them, because there are some rather inventive ways in which some of them die. By the way,
can I say something about that?
Yes.
Just not everyone notices it. I mean, a few people have said to me, "Oh, you've got these 4 funerals, but these characters all die in these, tragic, terrible ways." But if you really think about it, if you don't die of old age, you're going to be dying from some form of violence, basically. Something's going to be cutting your life short. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be doing 4 funerals and none of these people is dying of old age, then you either die from illness or from an accident, or somebody kills you, or you kill yourself. Those are the possibilities that my brain seemed to see. So I thought, well, let me cover the range of possibilities. So, although 1 or 2 of the deaths are a bit unusual, even given the category, there's no way to die, short of your old age designated death that isn't kind of, violent and a little bit unpleasant. I mean, there's no pleasant way to die anyway, I don't think. But, I wasn't getting a particular pleasure out of the fates that I was creating. I was actually sort of philosophically trying to cover the ground, if I can put it that way. Sandip, you're frozen.
I think my internet is Can you? Oh, actually now I can hear you. It was cutting in and out a little bit, but I think
now I can hear you again.
Ground, but not sure. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, good. One of the things, I mean, in the voice you talk about, it is a wickedly funny voice, given that it's often describing really dire things, and one of the funeral scenes is actually almost really hilariously funny, where somebody keeps trying to open the coffin to make sure it's the right person being buried. But I also wondered, as a writer, once you had this idea, did you suddenly feel like, oh, now I have to somehow deal with the challenge of writing about four funerals within the same family, the same place, with largely the same cast of characters, of course, plus a few extra ones that may have been added in the last 10 years. And, but it can't feel so repetitive. Is that partly why you started writing about four funerals? I mean, one is
So,
Jewish, one is Calvinist or Catholic.
yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, there's something theatrical in the structure of four acts, if you like. I do have something of a theatre background, and I quite consciously like the idea that you're seeing the curtain go up and a particular drama around this funeral plays out, then the curtain drops down again, and then when it comes up again, you're 9, 10 years later, and a great deal has happened, but it's not explained. You just see what's changed, essentially. But of course, there is repetition in that. And it's one of the reasons why I decided to find ways to try to vary what was playing out in each particular section of the book. So religion was one thing. I could have, of course, had this entire family belong to one faith, but then we would have had the same funeral service 4 times. And that would have been dull. So it was one way to kind of liven up the narrative, to make 4 different kinds of funeral services. I don't know whether it registers, but each section of the book takes place at a different time of year, so we cover the 4 seasons as well, and so on. Incidentally, that incident in the book that you've picked up on of the woman who keeps making this poor hapless man open the coffin so that she can check it's actually the right person in there, was one of the stories my friend told me on this first afternoon. It's a real story. So it was elements like that made me think, wow, you could really throw in some wild stuff into what might otherwise be sort of staid and conventional. So that's another way in which I hope I keep readers somewhat entertained.
And to get to the idea of the promise itself, which is basically there is this maid who's been working at this house and is a constant character throughout, who in the beginning we learn has been promised the house that she lives in, which is on the farm these characters live in. And the story goes along as to whether this promise is being kept or not kept, or the excuses people find to not honor this promise. And this I could really relate to in some ways, because in an Indian context we often hear this very cringe-inducing phrase where people say, oh, this maid has been in our house for so long, she's practically family. But of course she's not. We keep saying she's practically family, but she's never really family. That house will not probably be given to her. And so was it a conscious choice that even as you were, as the narrator, hovering over these people, hopping into each of their heads with such facility and jumping back and forth, with Salome, the maid, you don't get into her head as much. We see her, but she's often in the background washing dishes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the difference between an Indian context and a South African one, where that scenario is concerned, is that in South Africa, almost invariably, the domestic worker, the maid, would be a black woman working for a white family. And that bond is both very distant and very close. I had, a black nanny when I was a child, who I regarded kind of as a second mother. I was unbelievably, attached to her, emotionally, physically, all over her. And she, in fact, is the person I had in mind when I wrote this character. But, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that South Africa's racial history is incredibly charged. So, a woman like Salome, who's worked for this family for, her whole life, for the whole lives of, some of the children in this family, although they might feel incredibly attached to her, emotionally very dependent on her, they would not necessarily know anything about her own private life. I mean, these are women who usually have their own families, their own children, who are left with other relations to be looked after when they come and, live with a white family to look after the white children. It's a very bizarre, semi-colonial kind of setup. But I had to make a decision early on, seeing as I was, leaping around into the psyches of these various characters, as you picked up. Do I do the same thing with the black characters? And I made the decision that I would not, that I would only travel into the minds and the inner lives of the black characters in the book as far as the white characters around them perceive them. And I made that decision because the book is about white South Africa, white South Africans. And I wanted to convey the sense of what, the white psyche has been like in this country, over the last 40 years. And the white psyche of this country is not a pretty place. I know, I grew up in it. I partake in it. It's part of me. I'm part of it. And the brutal and unpleasant fact is, although we're nearly 30 years into democracy here, a person like Salome in real life in this country, a black woman, probably not highly educated, from a rural background, who works for a family like this, still has no voice, no presence whatsoever. And I wanted to convey that in a way that made it disturbing, again, to come back to that word I like, to make it disturbing and uncomfortable for readers, that, we don't know anything about this person, and yet she's so central. Why is that? As it happens, I mean, I have that particular decision seems to have agitated quite a lot of British commentators and readers. A lot of people sort of seem to feel that's been the wrong decision. But quite tellingly, nobody from South Africa, nobody of an African background who's read the book has found it odd at all. So, I'm satisfied in myself that choice carried over in some way in the mode that I intended it to, which is to say, I want readers to come to the end feeling like there's a question without an answer at the center of this book. There's a kind of a blank space, and it's bothersome to them. Again, I mean, to use the word useful, that seems like a useful outcome for a book. If somebody ends a book feeling disturbed by what's been in it, with a feeling that something is unresolved that should be resolved, for me, that's good. They're carrying it around with them, and in some way in their own lives, they may find an answer or be provoked into finding an answer. I don't like books that answer all the questions, tie up all the loose threads, and you can put it all away very comfortably when you close the book and feel that the world has been set to rights again, because most of the time the world is not ideal. It's not the way it ought to be, and certainly not in South Africa. So, yeah, that was my thinking, more or less.
Yeah, and I think what I found disturbing is that it's much easier in a story around race to deal with really horrible bigots, because you can feel self-righteous about your position with them. But the characters in here, even as the siblings, nobody is bigoted in that sense. If there is benign neglect, there's some kind of benign racism sometimes. And even the most progressive one, who is Amor, who is the one who most wants to keep her mother's promise, I was like, she keeps saying it, but she's not doing much about it. And I think that's what was felt very disturbing, because I felt I could easily see myself and other people kind of going about it in the same way of, good intentions, but not rocking the boat.
Quite. That's exactly right. I couldn't have put it better myself. I have a kind of theory about the novel, which is, open to correction. But my sense of it is that it evolved as a distraction for the middle classes. And as such, it's supposed to reflect, those middle class values back to readers. It's meant to reassure you that, there may be ruptures in the world, but ultimately things will be set to rights. Questions will be answered, bad people will be punished, good people will be rewarded. I mean, those are the satisfactions that a lot of people look for when they read a book. But that's always felt, unnatural, in the sense that it doesn't resemble what I observe of the real world. In the real world, a lot of the time, you never get an answer to questions. You never quite understand what happened. Bad people, even terrible people who, murdered thousands, die peacefully in their sleep. Good people often never receive any reward whatsoever. But you have a problem as a storyteller, because if you reflect the way the world actually works, you don't provide any of the satisfactions that a reader expects. So for me, writing a novel is a bit of a dance. I'm trying to mimic the incompleteness, the lack of resolution that I perceive in the world, but I'm also trying to provide, to some degree, the satisfactions that we look for in a story. Things must be resolved, even if imperfectly. Anyway, as part of this revised model that I try to bring to bear, I'm mistrustful of heroes or heroines who are unambivalently good and who function as a kind of moral beacon, telling us how we should live and what the right thing is to do. I mean, I don't know the right way to live. I can barely keep my own life together most of the time, and I think that's probably true for most writers. So the notion that I should be some kind of moral guide for other people is laughable to me. I'm an observer, not a leader, not a guide. So I mean, the book needed some kind of moral presence, given that so many of these characters are truly awful. And Amor is that. Her impulses are on the right side. She believes the promise should be seen through. She tries to deal with her family to suggest that. And yet, as you point out, how forceful is she, as a moral agency? She does ultimately do the right thing, but it takes a very long time. And then the right thing is very imperfectly resolved. Now, that's the solution I found for, the problem that I've sort of outlined, which is that I'm trying to convey how South Africa is. We're 27 years into democracy. Have we righted our historical wrongs? Has apartheid been cleansed from our system? Absolutely not. We're in a different place, and the rules are different, and the possibilities with the society are not what they used to be. But we're also not where we could have been at this point. So partly that's been
another promise not kept, or half kept.
Exactly. I mean, the unspoken allusion in the title is not just to this, very literal promise that's been made to Salome, but it's the promise that South Africa held or seemed to hold back in '94 in our first democratic election. And I don't think many of us feel that promise has been fulfilled. Very, very much not. So, this process of stalling and of not actually really taking the moral action is fueled not only by malevolent people, but by well-meaning people who just don't get it together. As you said, people like me or you who sort of it should be like that, but tomorrow, or we don't feel invested enough to push it, and so on. And it seems to me a lot of the world functions this way. Most of us would like to do the right thing, but we don't, or we just don't quite get it together, or we don't feel we have enough power to make it happen. And that's why the world is the way it is. So I was trying to convey some of that. Sorry, that's probably a bigger answer than the one you were looking for, but it seemed to deserve.
No, that's great. I mean, that's what we really want. You do want to get the bigger answers than the ones you're looking for. I mean, that is the whole point of having a conversation. But there is a line I remember that really struck me, and I wrote it down. Where, since you were talking about so many years since the democracy comes to South Africa, and you say apartheid has fallen. See, we die right next to each other. This is a scene in a hospital. In intimate proximity is just the living part we still have to work out. And it made me wonder, as a white South African, does it feel it was almost easier during the apartheid years when there was a greater moral clarity?
Well, I'm not sure easier is the right word, but
that's why I hesitated before using the word.
Yeah, although it may not be wrong. It was certainly easier to know what was right and what was wrong in those days. So, in fact, maybe it is the correct word. The moral zone we're in now is far less distinct. We used to know who the bad people were. They were the white nationalist government who, were administering the whole apartheid system. And the good people were the ANC resistance movements in exile. Well, the bad guys have gone. The good guys supposedly are in power. And look what they've done. I mean, anybody who's been following various commissions of inquiry in South Africa, very specifically the one into state capture, that's been unfolding over the past 3 years, will be left in no doubt as to how much corruption and plundering and looting our ruling party has indulged in. I mean, we're on the point, I think, of bankruptcy as a country, from what I can understand. And these were supposed to be our heroes. So it's very hard to measure the world in terms of good, bad, right, wrong, by the same standards that we used to apply, which is very much part of what I was trying to articulate earlier. In fact, that, books that divide the world into good people and evil people, that deal out justice in the form of, rewards for the good and punishment for the bad, they don't resemble the real world. The real world's like, our current scenario in South Africa, and maybe not so unusual if you look at the state of governments everywhere. But yeah, it's very, very hard to believe in right, wrong, good, bad as clear and distinct entities. If you really look clearly at how the world works, we're all of us a mixture. I think we're good in certain contexts, bad in others. Yeah. Depends on what our interests are, whether we're under threat, so on. Depends on your context.
Yeah, in some ways, it's like the high of watching Mandela coming out of prison with his fist in the air. No nation can. I mean, that was the tryst with destiny moment, and after that, you can't live up to the high and the hopes that moment generated. I mean, I don't know if that's possible. I want to open this up. We're having some questions coming in, but before we go to the question, I wanted to bring it back a little bit to India. And I was thinking that while something like race and caste are not interchangeable, but there is overlap in that. And I sometimes do wonder that, no matter what my position on caste is, however progressive I might like to think of myself, as an upper caste person in India, I just cannot undo generations of privilege that are in me. I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. do you think, and this is something that some of the characters in your book are also grappling with, and I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think liberal white South Africans face a similar dilemma?
Yes, although I don't think many of them even know it. But yes, I do. I mean, I'm a liberal white South African, born into privilege, born into power. My own conscience dictates that I would like to leave those things behind. How do you do that? Where do I go and hand in my privilege and my power? Is there a counter somewhere? It doesn't happen that way. So however guilty you may feel or be because of who you are, I mean, because of, you know, the life that fate has delivered you into, you can't really change it. How do you shed your class? How do you shed your race? You know, changing your position in society, you know, it's lots of us yearn to do it, but the practical steps by which, you know, such an undertaking might be completed are not clear, not at all. So yeah, certainly. You know, sadly, I think liberal white South Africa is only too satisfied with itself. Frankly, it feels it's done quite enough by, you know, allowing majority rules. So I don't think a lot of liberal white South Africans wrestle with their souls at night about, you know, the torments of their privilege. But maybe we'd be a little better off if, you know, more of us did. Though perhaps not, because as I say, the solution is not so evident. It's clear what the problem is.
Absolutely. I mean, even in reading The Promise, you know, you start off by thinking, oh, this is a promise and this promise must be kept. And as the book progresses and you see these characters over the years and you see both sides of the story, why the promise is not being kept, I think. And in the end, I mean, I, at least as a reader, didn't know how much, you know, was the promise still worth as much 40 years later? Was it as meaningful 40 years later as it was at the beginning of the book? And I don't know that I have a yes or no answer to that.
Well, one of the ironies, of course, about this particular promise is that, you know, so much family tension has been concentrated around the fact that this house has been promised to the domestic worker, but the house itself is a falling down kind of semi-ruin on an absolutely useless piece of land, and yet the family is dug in around keeping this. And sadly, this scenario is playing out all over South Africa right now, one way or another. I mean, maybe not literally in that case, but white South Africans justify to themselves endlessly why they should not give up anything that they have over and over. And
I mean, you have a line in there, holding on, holding out, an old South African tradition.
There you go.
Let me get some of the questions. We have a question from Anunna Chatterjee, who says she just wanted to share a curious fact. She happens to have a friend who is very similar to Anton, who's one of the siblings in many ways, right down to the book he never finishes, his alcoholism, and his unintended charm. The question is, Anton as the charming alcoholic is quite true to type. Was that intended, or was that the only way he could end up? And do you know many charming alcoholics?
There are some. Yeah, I'm not sure which part of the question relates to the only way he could end up as a failed writer, as an alcoholic.
I don't want to give away the ending also. Yeah, I don't want to give away what happens to him.
You mean Anton's ultimate fate? Yeah. You know, it gives me no pleasure to confess that, you know, Anton is pretty close to me age-wise. He's the character I had the most enjoyment in creating and writing. And I drew on large parts of myself for the creation of Anton. There's an admission for you. You know, not necessarily a great admission, because he's an incredibly messed up person, but of course, somebody who's full of internal conflict, ambition and frustration and failure is far more interesting than somebody who's very content with their life. So, as a character, he gave me great sort of pleasure. I like to think in some other universe, maybe Anton's life worked out. Maybe he turned out differently. But, that's another unspoken promise behind the title of the book, is the kind of promise that Anton felt his life held out to him, I think. There's a scene in the first section of the book where Anton's imagining his future, how he's going to lead nations and write poems, and how he sees himself in a kind of physical image eating the world. That's how most white men of my generation felt at that time. And, it's no longer a possibility that South Africa is holding out to people like me, and that's a very good thing. But, from Anton's point of view, of course, I suppose he feels all his promise was squandered and spilled. And there, in that sense, maybe his life could not have worked out any other way. I feel sorry for him, but not entirely sorry. He had a lot of advantages that other people didn't have, and the fact that he didn't put them to the use they might have been put is probably his fault.
Well, you use this phrase, eating the world, and we actually have a question from Shashwati who wants to ask you about that phrase, because she says it's an unusual but such an evocative expression of privilege. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad the image comes across that way. I mean, when you're writing it, I mean, as you would know, Sandip, you know what it is you want to convey, but you have to find the imagery for it. So when you're in the flow of it, various images present themselves, and from their sort of internal resonance, you pick up, that conveys the sense of what I have in my mind. And that particular image of eating the world very much felt like the right one. Again, the right one to convey the sense of a white man that age, that point in time in this country, would have felt the world was being held out to him like an apple, which he could bite into. He didn't have to do anything. We were talking earlier about privilege and power. Those belonged to Anton. Those were the shoes he stepped into. Eating the world is probably very much how his life felt to him at that point in time. And of course, it's not how things worked out for him, poor guy, but such is life.
Actually, we've talked about Anton and Amor, who is the sort of more progressive character in the book. But I was really fascinated by their sister Astrid, and mostly because she felt, to me, initially, she felt like the character who would be most the Stepford wife stereotype, cliche character. And yet, and then there's a point where she has an affair with a powerful black man. And she talks about how at one time she would have been repulsed at the thought of having sex with a black man. And she still wonders whether adultery with a black man is more sinful than adultery with a white person. And to me, in some ways, I felt like she is the character who made the greatest journey in this novel in terms of a racially changing country.
Well, yes and no. I mean, Amor, the young sister with her moral impulse, Anton, the brother with his sense of entitlement and power, for me are the twin poles of white South Africa, and probably the twin poles of my own soul, really. Astrid, for me, was sort of positioned somewhere in between the two. I mean, whatever the outcome, both Anton and Amor are in some way engaged with the question of the country in the form of this promise, this unfulfilled promise. Astrid is someone who's not engaged. Her only engagement is with her own life and her own satisfaction. So for me, she's a kind of a voracious, hedonistic, and a very, very self-centered person. And not unlike a great deal of the people I see around me in white South Africa. People are concerned only really with their own satisfactions, the satisfactions of their own appetites, which is human. It's not human. She's not a terrible person. She doesn't have, murderous motives or anything. Selfishness is her great sin, but it is a sin or a shortcoming. But for somebody like Astrid, as for a great many people out there in South Africa now, there has been a change in perception towards, fellow Black South Africans as the laws in this country have changed, as there's been more integration and these sort of enforced walls of separation that apartheid put on us have been removed. There's been a shift in perception. So a lot of people like Astrid, who may actually have internalized a feeling of disgust or revulsion towards, fellow Black South Africans, just because apartheid had inculcated that particular attitude that, we are superior, you are inferior. When that falls away, suddenly it's a discovery. Oh, these are human beings. And actually, some of them are quite sexy or attractive. And there's been in South Africa, I don't know how to convey it, but when I was growing up, advertising campaigns, what you saw, stories you saw on TV, stories you heard on radio, whatever the media were that were pumping out narratives around us, all those narratives were incredibly white. Black people really didn't feature. It wasn't that they were necessarily being portrayed as evil or other. They just didn't exist. So suddenly there's a change in narrative, and in advertising and in stories all around us, Black people are real and they have their own lives, and suddenly you perceive them differently. So the shift is quite big in a certain way that, I can have an affair with a Black person. Wow, I've really kind of shifted myself. But in another way, it's really quite a small, superficial shift. The sort of shift that might happen in your psyche if the society around you allows it. That's it. I don't think she's had a big transformation in the depths of her soul. It's a sort of aesthetic perception that's shifted. That's how I see that character. You, of course, are entitled to see her different.
This is not related to the book, but that made me curious. Do you see that? Did a similar shift happen in the gay community? Because you were growing up there at a time when it was actually criminal to be gay. So gays were erased, and then this thing that you're talking about, where Black characters are invisible. So that's sort of a double layer of invisibility. And I wonder if it just mirrored the larger society, or if there was more mixing there.
Well, I'm perhaps not the right person to ask, in the sense that, yes, homosexuality was illegal in apartheid years. It was part of the whole Calvinist morality that underpinned the system. But that fell away, and there was a great sort of transformation and change. But I think I was of the generation that basically internalized the feeling of fear and inferiority. So, the kind of liberation that happened for a lot of people post 94 wasn't a big sort of dawning for me. I think I carried too much internal homophobia maybe towards myself or some such. But there is a very, very interesting essay called Edenvale by a friend of mine. In fact, you know Mark Giffer, a very well-known South African journalist and non-fiction writer, called Edenvale, where he has looked at the lives of various Black men, gay Black men, in apartheid times, and how they managed to connect secretly. And I was very, very struck by how much interracial connection happened furtively through cruising, basically, which is the most unlikely place, or at least it was until I read this essay. And then I thought, well, of course, it's one of the obvious places where that sort of artificial barrier would break down. I recommend the essay, incidentally, Edenvale. Anybody who's interested in the point that's just been raised should look it up. I think it's available online. But I do think it was one of the areas where white and Black men were forging, sometimes, bonds that were not particularly emotional in nature, more carnal and self-serving. But a lot of people did form quite touching emotional connections that seemed to defy gravity. They certainly defied, the laws that were prevailing at the time.
Absolutely.
Very interesting subject, actually.
We're almost out of time. Let me just quickly take one or two other questions. And one is a question on structure. And how do you design and adapt to new writing approaches and techniques with each new novel?
It's a very big question.
We have 30 seconds. Don't worry.
Do we literally have 30 seconds?
We are, one of the things with digital, we can take a couple of extra minutes. It's digital. Nobody's waiting to come on stage right now. So
I'll try to be succinct in my response and just say, for a lot of writers, taking a fresh approach or reinventing a form every time you write a book is not part of the deal. You want to hit a formula, you want to deliver on that formula, your readers expect it, and there's a mutual satisfaction involved. I, for whatever reason, have felt a frustration in repeating myself. So I have, with varying degrees of success, no doubt, tried to reinvent myself to some extent with each new book by taking something entirely new and trying to find a new voice with which to deal with it. How I go about that, I wish I had a clear answer, because I think the task would be a lot easier if the path was that clear to me. I try to find a subject that I've not dealt with before that has a voltage that will keep me going for the 3 or 4 years that the book's going to involve. And then I try to find, as in this case, the approach, the notion of writing a family history through the device of 4 funerals. Mm-hmm. As I say, that was the first thing that attracted me, and it attracted me because I didn't know of another book that had been written in this way. So, it's very much the form as well as the theme that suggests itself, and that sort of takes me by the lapels and says, write me now. Don't know what the
There's
next
a big
one
book. There's a very big book that has come out in India right now, set in India's northeast, which is in the area near Shillong in Meghalaya, which is actually about these people journeying to a funeral. And it's been getting quite a lot of attention because it uses it to talk about the local traditions. And we have a question about funerals from Karthik, who asks, funerals as social events, have you borrowed from some real life funerals? I don't know if, Karthik, you've read the book, but some of what happens at these funerals, we hope didn't happen in real life funerals, but I'll let Damon answer that.
Well, as I said, this absolutely appalling incident where in my book it's an aunt who insists that the coffin gets opened so that she can check that it's her brother inside the coffin. I mean, that really happened to my friend. I've borrowed little anecdotes here and there. So some of the most unlikely stuff actually is the true stuff. I mean, life is continually surprising in that way. It outstrips anything your imagination can throw up. But yeah, I did lift various little anecdotes or moments. But of course, you have to tailor those moments or invent new ones of your own, because you're dealing with people that you shaped and created for the purposes of this narrative. And you can't just lift a story from somewhere else and dump it on them and expect that their personalities will fit with that scenario. There's a little bit of tailoring involved. So yeah.
You have to have customized grave diggers. I mean, they have to dig a grave that fits this novel. But there is one other question from Dibendu, who says, The Promise reminds me of Alan Howlinghurst's novels in terms of structures. Would you agree?
Well, you'd have to be more specific. I would, well, I'm trying to think. I mean, the structure of Alan Hollinghurst's last few novels has been really to have a central event that takes place quite early on. And then he's given himself this really enormous challenge, which he rises to admirably, of the action that follows subsequently is in fact, receding from this main central event. So I don't think in that sense that the promise overlaps with that structure. As I say, I think you'd have to be more specific. I can't really agree or disagree unless you put your finger on what it is about.
I had not about Alan Hollinghurst, but there was a moment in Promise where I suddenly had a flashback to a film I'd seen a long time ago, American Beauty, and there was this Kevin Spacey after he's dead. His voiceover is he's sort of observing his life and going into the lives of all the people in the neighborhood, and I suddenly had a little moment of flashback to that because of the voice of your narrator and the way it sort of dive bombs into people's heads and out of them again. I felt it was taking me on this little journey. But that's, people are reminded of strange things when there are odd connections which you can't always explain.
Well, sure, but I mean, I could speculate on various points about why that particular thought came to you. But I will just say that. Anyway, the threads disappeared for me. But the voice of the narrator, I do want to make this point quickly, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
The voice of the narrator became a very essential part of this book, because the book itself is so concerned with decay and death, of course, funerals. It really needed another element to push against that heavy downward pull. And the voice of the narrator is the voice of life. I think it's got a vitality, as you say. It moves very, very fast. So for me, the vitality of the narrative voice is what makes the material of the novel bearable. I mean, it certainly made it bearable for me to write, because writing about funerals and grief is, it's heavy. It's heavy stuff. I didn't want to be spending 4 years, sunk in that material, and I don't think most readers would want to even spend, a couple of days reading about it. But I think what makes it bearable, maybe hopefully better than bearable, is the vitality of the narrative voice, which is, humor. I think is the antidote to death. It shows us we're still living. As long as you can find something to laugh at, there's still a little bit of hope. And I like to think there's quite a lot of humor in the book.
It definitely is, and as you say in the book, the funerals, you realize, are actually about the living, not about the person who's already dead. But the last question we had from a listener is from Sudeshna, who says, when you accepted the award, you said you did so on behalf of African writers, many of whom remain unheard. Would you care to elaborate?
Well, if I had more to say, I might have said it at that time. No, I did recognize when the prize was given to me, I did recognize that across the board, African writing has done exceptionally well last year. Most of the major prizes were won by African writers, not all of them resident on the continent, but nevertheless, African writers writing about African subjects. So I very, very much wanted to take the platform and the moment that had been given to me to draw attention to that fact. It's very hard to know if that's a change in perception, but it was an opportunity maybe to crystallize a change in perception around African writing. This is a continent bursting with talent, bursting with stories, and it's sometimes exceptionally difficult to find an outlet for those stories, both here in South Africa and Africa generally, but also in the West. There's a kind of built-in resistance to African narratives. Not that it's the West's responsibility to publish our stories, but there is generally a kind of inbuilt resistance, both here and abroad, to African novels and African stories generally. So I was trying to draw attention to the fact that it's not only the few published stories that make it out of here that constitute the whole of our, storytelling pantheon. There are a lot of untold stories. There are a lot of unheard voices. And I hope that, the various prizes that African writers won last year might make it a little bit easier for those stories to find their way and find their way to, readers like you.
We are now really out of time, but I had also heard that when you come to India, that I wanted to end with a little India bit, there is apparently some kind of red exercise book that you carry from there to write in.
To any
I want to
Indian, this is going to be ridiculous because you know, these are the ledger books that you guys are absolutely familiar with, that all your sort of corner. In fact, I have them right to hand. Here you go. Every time I go to India, I buy a whole bunch of these ledgers, which every shopkeeper knows, and that are absolutely perfect for anyone who writes by hand in an old-fashioned way like me. So my room is, you know, stacked with these notebooks, and I'll be very, very sad when globalism, you know, knocks out your corner stores and the possibility of buying these red ledgers, because they've kept me going for quite a few years now.
I think we'll still have these red ledgers, and I hope that if for nothing else, that there is, in this post-pandemic world, it becomes easier to travel again soon, so that you're able to come back to India and restock on your red ledger books.
Well, I'd like to come back to India for many, many more reasons than just the ledgers. One of them is to see you and say hello to you, Sandip. But yeah, it would be great to attend this festival in person in some future year. That would be fabulous.
But let me thank you for spending this, well, a little over an hour with us. It was a huge pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And on behalf of Tata Steel, Kolkata Literary Meet, and the organizers, congratulations again. And thank you so much, Damon.
Thank you, Sandip. I had a great time talking to you. So till next time, thank you.
Thank you.